Top leaders from Israel and Saudi Arabia reportedly held their first ever meeting, potentially paving the way for a diplomatic victory ties down the road. Israeli media reports Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to the kingdom for direct talks with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This would be a historic first for both countries. However, Saudi Arabia quickly denied the meeting, saying that the Crown Prince only met with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. This comes as the Trump administration continues pushing for countries to establish formal relations with Israel and to promote a global campaign against Iran. Bahrain, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates have all followed suit, but Saudi Arabia remains hesitant. Secretary Pompeo spoke about the administration's foreign policy and pressure campaign against Iran over the weekend during his farewell tour across the Middle East.
Our policy has been consistent for the entire time that President Trump's been in office. It hasn't changed a bit. We've delivered on every commitment that we've made to countries throughout the Middle East. We've protected Americans. We've built up partners who want to be on America's side, who want to partner with the United States of America. There's no reason to think that'll change while President Trump's in office. We built a coalition that said that Iran is the central threat inside of the region. Then we built out a campaign that denied the regime the resources to underwrite Lebanese Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq.
All right, so for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News State Department and Foreign Affairs reporter Christina Ruffini. You're in Washington, Christina. So let me ask you this, just sort of give us the lay of the land. Why would a meeting between Israeli and Saudi leaders be so historic and significant, and why haven't they ever met before?
Well, they haven't met before because the Saudis, like most Arab or even Muslim-majority states, don't officially recognize Israel, and they support the Palestinian cause for statehood. They've traditionally viewed Israelis as an occupying force, and they don't even have formal diplomatic relations with their government, although, of course, back-channel communications have been going on for decades. But it's significant because this so-called peace deal with other Arab Gulf nations, and I would argue that technically it's not a peace deal since these countries weren't at war, but I digress, that these peace deals are moving the momentum forward toward a more unified Middle East and a unified front against Iran, which both the Saudis and the Israelis view as a threat. Look, it's less that the Saudis genuinely want to be friends with Israel, but, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Iran has launched several attacks against Saudi facilities in the last year. They're on the opposite side of proxy wars, other forces in conflicts like Yemen, and all of these nations know that if they want to buy advanced weaponry from the U.S., including F-35 fighters, they have to make it clear that those are not going to be used against Israel. And it may just be one meeting, but, you know, it's one meeting they didn't have before, and it's a start.
So, Christina, Saudi Arabia has been hesitant to form any diplomatic ties with Israel, as you point out, for those reasons. So what can you tell us about this specifically? And I'm curious why the kingdom is denying that the meeting even happened, but we are hearing from the Israelis.
Yeah, the way both these countries have treated the so-called leak, although I would argue it's a plant, of the news about the meeting, it really is playing to their domestic audiences. Israeli officials leaked it to the press in Israel because for them, even the meeting itself is an accomplishment. But for the Saudis, they don't want to signal that they're softening their stance on Israel or even possibly abandoning the Palestinian cause. They also don't want to announce any kind of deal until they know and can say what they're going to get out of it and say that to their domestic audience. So for now, it's deny, 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 and hope that, you know, nobody in Riyadh has a subscription to the Jerusalem Post or Haaretz.
So we know that this is all part of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Why is the Trump administration and the State Department pushing so hard to have these countries like Bahrain, Sudan, the UAE, now Saudi Arabia, normalize ties with Israel specifically? Is it just about isolating Iran, or is there something more?
Well, Anne-Marie, if I were a cynical reporter here in Washington, I would say that well, that's not me at all. I would say this administration's focus on Israel and getting these other countries to normalize relations with Israel, of course, plays into domestic politics. Like we just talked about with the Israelis and the Saudis, you know, the U.S. has a domestic audience it's trying to appeal to as well. And, you know, President Trump's evangelical voter base and loyal Jewish Republicans who have deep-pocketed support for this president, they want this kind of action on Israel. Secretary Pompeo also, look, he wants to run for president someday. It's not a secret. And this is something something he can point to as an accomplishment and say, look, we helped take steps to preserve Israel for the Jewish people. You know, he can say, I'm an evangelical Christian, and if you vote for me, this is the kind of policy you're going to get. However, critics have to admit that this has been an accomplishment, one that probably could not have happened under another administration because of their ability to break norms or disregard the way these things are normally done, and because Secretary Pompeo and Mr. Trump were so singularly focused on this issue, both the pressure on Iran and support for Israel. It left very little oxygen left for anything else. So if these Gulf states, if these Muslim states wanted to get the attention of the administration, if they wanted something out of the U.S., they knew that recognizing Israel or normalizing relations with Israel was the best way to do it. And, you know, it possibly leaves parts of the Middle East a little bit more stable than how the administration found them. And that's something that they can point to at the end of their term here.
So let's look ahead, Christina. As President-elect Biden gears up to take power in January, he's announced his Secretary of State will be longtime diplomat Tony Blinken. We know that Mr. Blinken has an extensive foreign policy experience. So how will that shift under a Biden administration, especially when it comes to the Middle East? It's no secret that President Obama and Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, didn't have the best of relationships, certainly not the one that he and President Trump enjoy. What do you know about Blinken and his relationship with the Israelis, but also the leaders in the Middle East?
And Netanyahu and Biden have a complicated relationship as well. So this is going to be interesting because the incoming Secretary of State, if he's confirmed, Tony Blinken, is a big supporter of the JCPOA, which is, you know, for those of you who aren't a nerd like us, it's everybody's favorite foreign policy acronym. You can just call it the Iran nuclear agreement. President-elect Biden has said he wants to try and maybe look at getting back into that deal. The Trump administration hated that deal and famously said it, you know, basically wasn't worth the paper it was written on. But, you know, President-elect Biden, excuse me, has said if Iran would go back into compliance, that's something they would be willing to look at. But it's hard to go backwards in any policy, especially a complicated agreement that took so much work to get together in the first place. The Trump administration approach was to freeze out Iran, both with sanctions and then come up with these alliances between Israel and the Gulf nations to kind of create a fortification against their aggressive action. The Obama administration took another approach. They were trying to bring Iran into the fold and offer more carrot than stick. Neither tactic worked particularly well. You can argue about which one worked worse, but we'll have to see which approach the incoming administration takes, if they fall back into old routines or if they try to take advantage of some of the momentum in some of these places and come up with a hybrid approach to deal with Iran, who is, you know, essentially the mean girl of the Middle East.
Love having you on, Christina. Thank you so much as always.
Nice to see you guys.
We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.